Today we have Nick Hutchison on the podcast. Nick is the visionary force behind BookThinkers, a popular book review site and host of the podcast BookThinkers, Life-Changing Books, which features interviews with renowned authors like Grant Cardone and Lewis Howes. Nick joined us today to discuss his book, Rise of the Reader, Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn. He talks about the incredible impact of books and how to apply what you're reading and learning to your everyday life. He also provides relatable stories and easy to implement habits that motivate you to take action and embrace the power of reading. Nick, welcome to the podcast. I'm going to jump right into your book, Rise of the Reader, with you. Where I'm going to start is whenever I'm reading a book in preparation for a conversation with an author, when I see a line I love, I have to turn it into a question, which is why I'd love to read something I read from you early in your book. And you have your color in what I share for our audience. As a guiding principle, you say reality is negotiable. Reality is limitless. The right book at the right time can change your life. Tell us more on that one.
Well, the proof is in the pudding, right? Over the last 10 years or so, I've received testimonials from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Some of them I know, most of them I don't know, that have told me how the book recommendations I've made have completely transformed their lives. I genuinely do believe the right book at the right time can change your life. The first part of that guiding principle, reality is negotiable, stems from The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, one of my all-time favorite books. And in the beginning of The 4-Hour Workweek, Tim says that the new rich, right, this new group of emerging rich people, they're not focused on material possessions. They're focused on time and mobility. They're optimizing for a life that uniquely fulfills them, not society's expectations, right? That box that it tries to shove us all into, but something that uniquely fulfills them. And that when you start to state your intentions to the universe will conspire to assist you. A little bit of Paulo Coelho there. And so I've started to bend reality to my will. And again, the proof is in the pudding. I've been reading for just short of 10 years now, and I've designed my dream life. It's limitless, and I genuinely believe that. And I believe in the power of these books so much. They've helped me in every area of my life imaginable. So I just can't get enough of them, Clayton.
So the challenge with that is because I'm also, obviously, I've got a podcast where I'm talking to authors. So I'm with you. I'm big on books, big on reading, big on the power of what they can do in our lives, just like you. The challenge we have, Nick, is the average person hasn't read a book in the last year. Over 50% of people haven't read a book. And so when we look at that, the question that comes up for you, for me, how do we help them fix that? And you talk about something simple like the 15-minute rule. How can people use that to overcome some of these challenges with not reading books because they don't have enough time to do it?
Yeah, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I wasn't much of a reader either. So if anybody's listening today and they haven't read a book in the last year, I'd challenge you with the following question, if you don't have enough time. If I paid you $10,000 to read a book by the end of January or February or whenever you're listening to this, if I paid you $10,000 to read a book by the end of the month, do you think you could do it? And that same person who normally just told me they don't have time, they're like, oh, I could read 5, right? And so it's not a question of whether or not we have time, but it's a question of whether or not we value reading enough to prioritize it in our schedules. And there are a lot of things fighting for our attention. I mean, a book is an act of delaying gratification, right? Nobody really loves cracking open a book and reading for a little bit, at least not in the start. They'd rather be watching Netflix or playing on their phone for a little bit. And those things are okay to continue doing. But here's what I recommend to answer your question. Replace 15 minutes of your morning Instagram scrolling and the first 15 minutes of your evening Netflix or sports or whatever you're watching with reading a great book. Not find time, right? But replace a low impact activity with a higher impact activity, at least 15 minutes. And when you read for half an hour a day, 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening, you're reading for a half an hour, which for somebody who's just starting, that's about 20 pages. You do that 5 days a week, take the weekends off, that's 100 pages a week. And Clint, as you know, somebody who reads a lot of books, most of these books these days, like they're averaging 200 pages, 250 pages. So
Yeah,
that's a
250.
book every 2.5 weeks, if you can keep up that pace of just replacing a little bit of Instagram in the morning and a little bit of Netflix in the evening, or insert your social media.
And let's go back. You said growing up as a teenager, you weren't that into books, you weren't that into reading. I think it was one of your earlier jobs. You had a mentor, I believe it was Kyle, and he got you into the personal development movement. First, he got you into podcasts, and then through the podcast, you started noticing, because you really zoomed in on podcasts about personal development, about success, about improving your life. And somewhere in that journey, you realized, wait a second, most of these guests are talking about books they've read. And there's something about standing on the shoulders of giants that I can do. So what did that look like for you, that deep dive into the personal development podcast? And then how did that transition for you from the podcast to reading?
When I started at this early job, it was an internship between my junior and senior year of college or university. And Kyle, I think he saw some unfulfilled potential in me. I think he saw this 20-year-old sort of cocky, a little bit arrogant, know-it-all type sales guy. And I was a little rough around the edges at the time. And Kyle took me on a few local sales trips, and he would talk with me, but he would also say, hey, do you mind if we listen to a little bit of a podcast that I'm currently listening to? And he'd frame it for me. Hey, this successful podcast host loves to interview successful people about what they've done to become successful. And he would just press play. And I was commuting 1 hour each way, 5 days a week. So I was in the car for 10 hours a week. And he said something to me one day, just kind of offhanded, like, listening to the same song or the same playlist for the 1000th time, the 300th time, it's not going to get you closer to where you want to be in life. But the right podcast might. And that's why I listen to them. And I was really insecure when I was 20. I cared way too much about what other people thought of me. So I wanted to know all of the music and kind of be up to date on it, be able to rap the lyrics at the bar or whatever. And Kyle was a cool guy, but he was listening to podcasts. And I saw that as something that I wanted to replicate. So anyway, I start to consume a ton of these shows, 1 hour each way in the car, 5 days a week. And just like you highlighted, I heard so many of these successful people give at least some credit for their success to the books that they were reading. And the same titles kept popping up over and over and over again. Sometimes these shows would ask these guests about the books directly, but a lot of times they were just bringing them up organically. Like, hey, how'd you get started in real estate? Or how'd you get started in coaching? Or how'd you get started in business? And they would say, well, I read a book. And so, yeah, I just went to my local Barnes & Noble bookstore, one internship lunch hour, grabbed a bunch of books, and the rest is history. I mean, I have been hooked ever since.
And so something I want to dive into with you and chew on a little is this idea that we share. I always say, to design the lives we want to live, we need to, one, fix our hardware, which are unconscious thoughts. We need to fix our software, which is our conscious thinking. And we need to change our operating systems, which are our daily habits. You talk about this idea that if you're dreaming of changing the world, going against the grain, or at least living a life that fulfills you, you must start by rewiring your brain. Can you tell us more about that, and we can wrestle with that one together for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I agree with you. Hardware, software, and what was the third one that you referenced?
Operating system.
Operating system. Yeah, I agree. We need to focus on upgrading all three of those. I mean, the first time that I really started to think about this was with gratitude. So I was somebody in my early 20s who would default unconsciously, consciously, and basically in all types of conversations to sort of like the victim mentality or a scarcity mindset. I was always without. I always wanted something different than my current reality. And I read in a series of books early in my journey about gratitude and mindfulness. And so I started to practice gratitude on a daily basis. I started to journal about 3 things that I was grateful for every single day. And what happened was I started to look for and filter for opportunities to be grateful during my day so that the next morning when I would go to write 3 things I was grateful for, I could go, oh, those were the 3 things. And so gratitude, identifying opportunities to express gratitude, became a default response for me, a default pathway. Think about driving on the highway and a Lamborghini flies past you. Now, a previous version of myself would say, oh, I'm so jealous. Like, I wish I had a Lamborghini. And then I started to default to, well, I'm so happy that I'm driving a car and that I have a car. I mean, how amazing is that? So many people are without a car. Look at how cool this is. I mean, I literally started to think that way. And it was through repetition that happened. And I started to upgrade my operating system. I started to upgrade my unconscious, my subconscious, as well as my conscious self. And I started to talk about gratitude with people. And I mean, we're recording this at the end of December 28th. I am finishing up a year of gratitude. And what I've done in our internal Slack channel, which is our communication channel for the agency that I run, I write 3 things that I'm grateful for every day in there, and a bunch of people on our team do as well. And I haven't missed a day this entire year. And so it's just become part of who I am. But I had to make that deliberate choice to install that new behavior of journaling 3 things every single day. And as a result, it became a default pathway for me. I rewired, some things that were previously wired to scarcity, and now they're wired to abundance, which is so cool.
And if I'm not mistaken, your shirt that you're wearing right now, because it's black on black, does that say gratitude?
It does, yes.
There we go. There we go. So living what you're saying. And you talk about this idea of you rewired yourself by shifting how you were thinking. Can you tell the listeners about this concept of neuro-linguistic programming and how you use that to shift those thoughts so you can rewire more than just gratitude, because you're doing gratitude, but there are other thoughts that we're having. Some say 60, some say 80, some say 100,000 thoughts a day. Most of them recurring negative thought loops. How do we get in there and shut down that noise?
Yeah, one of the early podcasts that I became obsessed with as I was commuting during that internship, so we're talking over 10 years ago now, was called The Science of Success with Matthew Bodner. And I don't think it's still running today, but that was one of the concepts that he talked about pretty early in that podcast. And I consumed everything that he put out. And so just like you mentioned, there are a lot of thoughts. The number is up for debate, but there are a lot of thoughts that are running subconsciously in our minds every single day. A lot of them are negative. I've heard that as we're growing up, we hear 8 no's for every yes that we hear as kids. And again, those numbers are up for debate, but it's overwhelmingly negative. And we're consuming social media content that's divisive. We're consuming news content that's divisive. We're consuming water cooler talk at the office that's full of gossip, and it's overwhelmingly negative, and people complain, everybody's a victim. So we are consuming a lot of this, and as a result, whether we want it to or not, it impacts the way that we think about ourselves. It impacts the way that our minds just automatically run in the background. And so we have to insert positive environmental cues, new habits, new thoughts, books like the ones that are behind me, and start to reprogram. And reprogramming happens in a couple of different ways. It can happen in this big euphoric moment, which is pretty rare and hard to create intentionally, or it can happen by rewiring a pathway with a little bit more intention, right? Small steps in the right direction over a long period of time. And there's a great book called Learn, Improve, Master, which I don't reference in the book, but it's by a cool author named Nick Velasquez. And he talks about a pathway in a meadow, right? Imagine there's one default pathway, but you want to create a new one. And so every single day you start walking this new path. And at first the grass gets a little trampled, but you can't really see the new pathway. But every single day you take that new path. Eventually that becomes the default because the other one sort of grows back, right? Grass takes over, the earth takes over, nature takes over. And your new path, the one that you've been trampling on every single day for a year, that becomes the default path that a new person would take if they stumbled into this field, right? Same thing happens with our brains. And so by deliberately inserting gratitude, for instance, as a practice, as a daily practice every single day, I'm filtering for it, I'm focusing on it, I'm speaking it into existence, that becomes your default way of thinking. And so we have to rewire, we have to neuro-linguistically reprogram these negative thought loops into positive thought loops. And that's what books are great for, because they open us up to a wildly new set of perspectives. And, in the book, I talk about this concept, which I'm really starting to double down on, called play bigger triggers. And a play bigger trigger is an environmental cue that reinforces the person you're looking to become. And it can come in many forms. It can come in the form of motivational wall art, which I have a ton of behind my screen in my office space. It can come in the form of souvenirs and books that you've read that remind you of the person that you're becoming. It can come in the form of cool desk trinkets or tattoos. I mean, anything that the clothing that you're wearing, my shirt literally says gratitude on it. All of these things, I'm picking them up unconsciously, subconsciously, consciously, all day long, every day. And it's reinforcing the person I'm looking to become, so that when a negative news article comes into my universe, it doesn't grab me. It doesn't create a new pathway, because I'm overwhelming it with the positive.
So let's talk about one that you just mentioned there on the play bigger triggers. Because you talked about tattoos. I picked up a ton of commonalities in our book. And I'll go a little long on this one, Nick, but I have a tattoo on my forearm that has a design I did that captures both the concept of Memento Mori and Amor Fati. It's a skull within a flame, very, very small, not, don't picture a giant skull on my forearm. And that's within a greater design that shares some hints of purpose, direction, and time or focus. And so the idea being, remember I must die, celebrate fate, and hey, I know what direction I'm going. Now I got to get the work done. And a large part of that is reading, is books. You also have a number of tattoos, including one about Memento Mori, but you have two more, one on each wrist. Can you talk about how those tie into PBT and what the purpose for you was in getting those as part of that desire to be able to look down and say, all right,
Sure. And I also have, I didn't write about it in the book, but I also have an Amor Fati tattoo on my right bicep. And I have some purpose related tattoos as well. I have about 35 or 40 tattoos. I love collecting them. So, like you highlight in the book, I talk about play bigger triggers, these positive environmental cues, and I talk about how I've taken it to the extreme. I've literally tattooed myself with similar messages to the ones that you've just highlighted. And so on my neck, I have Memento Mori, which again is a daily reminder that we are all going to die. And that could be viewed as depressing. I'm sure if you've talked about your tattoos before, Clint, on this podcast, that it wouldn't surprise your audience that you can view death through a positive lens. You can say, oh, because life is finite, I must prioritize my time efficiently. I must be the best version of myself so that I don't end up living with regret, wishing that I had done more. And so every single day when I step out of the shower and I see that tattoo on my neck, right above my heart, in the mirror, it reminds me of the life that I'm looking to live. And it helps me create a little bit of urgency in my life. I don't want to fall asleep at the wheel and end up regretting the life that I've lived, right? I want to live life to the fullest. On my left wrist, I have a few tattoos, but one of them includes the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And it goes back to our earlier conversation about gratitude. I'm looking at this tattoo. I don't know, when I'm wearing short sleeves, I don't know how many times I see it subconsciously every single day. I mean, hundreds, like it's always in my environment. And so I'm always reinforcing that pathway of gratitude. That's where I'd like to be. That's what I always want to default to. And on this wrist too, I also have ataraxia, which is another Stoic concept of stillness. And if I ever feel like I'm reacting emotionally or my heart starts beating faster and I'd like to control it, I can look down to this tattoo and remember this concept of stillness, slow things down, operate from a place of logic, get back to logic and away from emotion. And so that tattoo's also served me. I didn't write about it in the book, but it's also on my left wrist. And then on my right wrist, like we've talked about, reality is negotiable. And I've already explained this one, but society is persistent. It always wants you to conform to its ideals. And every single time I feel like there's pressure, I can look at this tattoo and say, reality is negotiable. Remember, this is the core of who you are. This is what you believe in. And I can reinforce that. I can feel it. And then just to highlight one that you can't see, which is I also have a Morpha T on my right bicep. And I got that tattooed in Rome, which was really cool. Got this one tattooed in Athens. And yeah, it's just celebrate fate, the love of one's fate. You have a choice to view every situation in life through the lens that benefits you the most. Why not view everything outside of your sphere of control as neutral or maybe even positive? And so I think it's a really cool concept.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me. Yeah, the whole concept, everything that happens for the best possible reason. We may not know what it is today, but we may find out in the fullness of time. Area I want to take it now is one of the challenges with books. So many people that we see read them do nothing with it. And so I always say, Nick, like it's the equivalent of mental masturbation is like, I'm just going to read a book, then throw it back on the shelf and not do anything about it. So the question then becomes, how do we change that? You point out that many people read books on personal finance, investing, entrepreneurship, nutrition, exercise, communication, or travel without ever trying the recipes in the actual books. So how do we change that? What are the 3 problems you see that are holding people back from actually taking action on the books that they buy?
Yeah, we can touch on those 3 problems in a minute because I do believe that most problems stem from them. I'd love to paint one additional metaphor for everybody listening or watching today. Imagine you buy a book on the world's best chicken parm, right? It's a chicken parm recipe book. And you buy it because that's your favorite dish and you want to make it at home. And you study that thing. I mean, every single page has highlights and circles and dog ears and highlighter marks and whatever, and coffee stains. And you even buy all the ingredients, right? You get everything prepped, the world's best chicken and crust and everything. It's all ready to go, pasta. And then you never make the chicken parm. That would seem really weird, right? But people do that with the books they're reading. They buy a book, from Arnold Schwarzenegger on how he went from, dream to reality and created the strongest vision possible. And then they never execute their bodybuilding goals or whatever the case is. Like you read Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson because you want to be inspired on innovation and sort of that intersection of art, creativity, and business, and you never start anything yourself. So I think it's goofy. Unfortunately, it definitely happens that way for a lot of people. So yeah, I think that people are choosing the wrong books. People don't have any frameworks to implement those books. And, I have so many tips and tricks and strategies in the book, in my book, Rise of the Reader, for overcoming these. And I'll give one example right now that I think will resonate with everybody. So years and years ago, I started attending personal development conferences. And I would show up to these conferences and maybe there were 8 speakers in one day. And everybody's talking about something different, but it's all exciting. And you're not filtering for anything in particular. So you're just taking crazy notes about all different types of subjects. And you're so overwhelmed, you're drinking from a fire hose, and you go home and you intend on implementing what you've just learned, but you don't. The notebook goes back on the shelf and you don't change any behavior. And then you sign up for another one and the same thing happens, and another one and the same thing happens. And you're spending time and money to go to these events, but you're not doing anything about it. So that's actually the first place that I really started to become aware of this issue with intention. If you don't set an intention for the events that you're going to, and you're just taking notes on all types of random material, the chances that you actually move forward and implement something are pretty low. And so I started going to these events and I would set an intention. I would say, my goal is to learn 3 new presentation styles from the speakers on stage. And that's all I would filter for. Or my goal is to set up a virtual coffee with 5 different authors at this event so I could tell them about my business, BookThinkers. And that's all I would filter for. And I started to make so much more progress in my life at these events. Eventually it hit me, why aren't we doing this for the books that we're reading? We see a book on Instagram or something like that. We get all excited. We buy it. We read it. We take all these amazing notes and nothing changes. Why does that happen? And so again, I talk about tons of different things in the book, but I'll share this one example. I'm a little long-winded right now. Feel free to stop me if you want, but I love to set an intention for each book that I read. And a lot of times that intention follows the SMART goal framework. So for anybody in the audience that's not familiar with it, SMART is an acronym. I have a spin on it, but the traditional definition is S stands for specific. M stands for measurable. You need to know whether or not you've achieved your goal. It needs to be measurable. A stands for attainable. You need to set a realistic goal. R stands for relevant, written. There's a couple different ways that you could look at this. Relevant means you're emotionally connected to it, right? The book is solving a problem. It's developing a skill set that you're aware is holding you back. It's satisfying curiosity. Like you have an emotional connection to it. And T stands for time bound. So you give yourself a deadline for taking action. So when I'm picking up a new book, let's just say the book in front of me is $100 Million Leads by Alex Hormozy. It's a new book on lead generation for service-based businesses.
I love it.
Yeah. Instead of just picking up the book and hoping that it's going to change my life, I'll set a SMART goal. So find and implement at least 2 new lead generation strategies for my business, BookThinkers, by the end of January. Because I care so much about my business, the work that we're doing. I want to create an even bigger business and help even more authors achieve their potential, right? That is specific. I know what my goal is for the book. It's measurable. When I'm done, did I implement at least 2 new lead generation strategies in my business? It's attainable. I didn't say make $100 million. I just said find and implement 2 strategies. Is it relevant to my life? Heck yes, it is. I'm emotionally connected to it. And I will talk about where I write it in a second. And it's time bound. I said by the end of January. So I give myself a deadline to take action. Action is built into the way that I think about reading these books. And then I add the word because on the end of this to spice it up and add even more emotion. Because, right? I care so much about what my business does for people, blah, blah, blah. And what I'll do with that intention, that SMART goal, is I will write it on the inside cover of the book. And then I will review the intention every time I read another chapter, each reading session, whatever the cadence is. So I'm sharing my goal with the book so that the book can share the goal, information that I could take action on back with me. Our brains have this natural highlighter, the reticular activating system. And I want to filter for only the information that's most relevant to the problem I'm looking to solve, which is lead generation. Alex might talk about all types of other things that are exciting, quotes that I want to remember, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't help me achieve my goal. I'm optimizing for action, not checking the box and saying, I read $100 Million Leads so that everybody will think I'm cool. No, I'm looking to take action on the book and I'm looking to implement 2 things from it. So that was a ton of information that I just threw at everybody, Clint, but hopefully everybody could find that useful as well as follow along.
Yeah, and what really stood out for me, so Nick, how many books are you consuming a year on average?
Right now, about 2 books per week, so 100 books per year, but I will also remind everybody that it's my full-time job.
You're doing 100 a year, rock solid, 104 without vacations. I'm doing about 50 and having conversations with authors. And here's where I really start to wonder sometimes, right? Is that intentionality that you're bringing to these books, is there are only so many hours in our days, right? How do you take one or two nuggets from every single one of those books and bring it into your life? And because I even struggle with this one a little, that's why I'm asking. Like, I do recognize, I'll digress. I do recognize that, because there's some power to this. If I'm on a podcast and someone's asking me questions, answers are just coming out from books. So part of it is we're subconsciously wiring ourselves through these books to live a certain way. We might not even recognize we're doing it, but then when someone asks us where that behavior comes from, it's like, oh, Jim Collins in Good to Great said this, and that's why I've built this flywheel over here to do that. And so we don't realize it. But if we want to take the intentional route, which is what you're doing, and I love it, how do you intentionally take 1 to 2 nuggets from 100 books a year and put those into the fabric of your DNA so that the Nick tomorrow is different than the Nick today?
Great question. And it will take me a minute to unpack it. So when I talk about the importance of reading and somebody is just starting their journey, I love to say that when you're just starting your reading journey, quantity is more important than quality. So what I mean by that is, I think you want to build a good solid base of understanding, a foundation to operate from. And that requires reading tons of books on all different types of subjects and just kind of trying to internalize them, trying to take a little bit of action, but don't worry too much about it. Quantity, when you're first starting, matters a little bit more than quality. Then as you mature as a personal development reader and you start to understand what brings you the most joy in life, what you want to work on, what problems you want to solve, what skills you want to build, then quality becomes a little bit more important. And then you should start to optimize for action, implementing 1 or 2 things from every book you read. Now, where my reality sits today is that about 50% of the books that I'm reading are for my podcast or my social media channels. And my intention for those books is to find at least 5 or 10 things to share with my audience that I find interesting, lessons that I've already learned so that I have a conversation point with the author or for my audience. It's not always optimizing for action. So I would say the other 50% of the books that I am reading, closer to your number, I am optimizing for action. I'm looking to solve problems, right? Those are books that I've deliberately chosen to read. There's no money related to them, right? I'm reading them for my own personal pleasure and time. And I do have systems that I work from. So I have an activity tracker that I use every single day that houses all of the activities that I'm implementing. And I'm measuring my activity and I'm journaling about it and everything like that. I have an accountability group that actually I have 2 that I meet with on a weekly basis. And I talk about, here are the couple of things that I've read this week that I'm going to try to implement. And then the following week, I recap and talk about if this is behavior that I'd like to continue with or not. So I do have a pretty robust system built around it. The last thing that I'll mention is that you kind of highlighted this too, is that even if you don't implement something from every single book you read, these books are still changing us. There's a great book called The Art of Learning by Joshua Waitzkin. And Joshua Waitzkin was an 8-time national chess champion, but also an 8-time international mixed martial arts champion in some discipline. I don't remember which one. And he talks about this interesting form of learning. He calls it form to leave form, or numbers to leave numbers, where you study a subject so intensely that it becomes ingrained in your subconscious. Like if you read an entire book on one specific subject, all of the case studies, the miscellaneous information, all of the storytelling, your subconscious can then operate on your behalf, just like you're talking about. You could say, like, you might have implemented something from Good to Great by Jim Collins without realizing that you have, because that information is stored and you might be operating with it unconsciously. You might not even realize that you're using it. These books have other benefits too, right? If you're reading a physical paper book, you're improving your attention span, you're improving your vocabulary. And those skills are transferable to other areas of your life. And so reading has so many other benefits too.
Well, something that ties there, because you were talking about that, and when I read in your book, something that really resonated for me, because I'm not always the greatest note taker, and I'm not always the greatest person at forced repetition. which means that, of these 50 books a year, I don't necessarily remember a lot per se, Nick. And I'd say part of that is because, similar to what you talked about with that first half of the books, most of those 50 books that I'm reading to be able to have a conversation with the author. A lot of the content in the book may already be in my DNA because it's something I've already adopted. So I'm not necessarily reading to say, hey, I've got to memorize this book. But you gave a poignant example in your book about a memory person being up on the stage and saying to the audience, hey, who's read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Almost everyone, because it was a personal development conference, puts up their hand. I say it's my number one book that I recommend people read. And then he says, what are the 7 habits? And everyone chuckles because almost nobody in the audience remembers what the 7 habits are. So the question then becomes, intention setting aside, because that's one powerful mechanism we can use. But what are the other ways that we can take this meat that we're trying to use, because we're setting an intention to get some powerful things out of these books? How do we commit those? Like Josh said, how do we make those so that they're living in us subconsciously? What's some of the memory trick that you would suggest to people?
Yeah, Kevin Horsley is the memory guru, also author, that was on stage and said that during the TED Talk. And one of the greatest lessons that I've learned from Kevin is that repetition does lead to retention. And I'll repeat that because everybody can retain it more efficiently, right? Repetition leads to retention. And there are a couple different directions that I could talk about this, but one of the ways to build repetition into your process is this is kind of how I read today. I state the intention for the book, and I'm only filtering for the actions that I can take related to that intention. So that's kind of a prerequisite. The first time I go through the book, I try to separate reading and note-taking. They're two totally separate activities. I've read too many productivity books to think that any form of multitasking is a good thing, right? So I'm just trying to read the book all the way through my first pass. Now, if I find something, right, if my RAS filters for an action that's related to my intention, in the Alex Hormozy example, a lead mechanism, like a new way to improve leads in my business or something, I'll circle it just quickly. I try not to disrupt my reading momentum. I'll just bracket it off. I'll circle the page number. I might star something, but I don't want to lose that reading momentum. So I'll continue to read, right? All the way through the book. Now, my second pass through, I will only read the information on the pages that I've circled or bracketed off. So that's a second pass through the book. That's a form of repetition. Repetition leads to retention. And so my second pass through is a lot quicker because I'm only reading 2% of the book, 1% of the book the second time through. That 1% that's most relevant to me. Now, I might find 10 items in $100 million leads that I could implement, but my goal is only 1 or 2. And so what I'll do is I'll rewrite all 10 of them on a physical piece of paper. That's another form of repetition. And it's a different experience. It's multisensory. I'm writing it down on a piece of paper. I'm cementing it into my memory. And then I'll look at that list and I'll reread it. Again, another form of repetition. And I'll say, what 20% of these activities can lead to 80% of the change? I'm only looking to implement 2 or 3 things, 1 or 2 things, not all 10. And then I'll look at that list and I'll try to think what's easiest to implement. What are my biggest weaknesses? What resonates with me the most? What am I most excited for? What 20% of these should I implement, right? And I'll choose 2 things. Now, I will also rewrite that list into my Evernote online notebook, another form of repetition. I'm typing it out. And then I'll plug those 2 things that I'm going to implement into my activity tracker. Again, another form of repetition. And then I see them every single day, right? Because I'm in my activity tracker every single day. I measure all my health goals. I measure my business goals. I measure everything in there. So I see it all the time. It's a form of repetition. And again, repetition leads to retention. So there are some other mechanics there, the forgetting curve and some other forced repetition things that we could talk about. But what's nice is my SMART goal bakes in a few things that are important. The prerequisite to take action, the filter to take action, and an emotional connection. Emotional connection is really important for memory as well. And then as I work through the book, I'm repeating the information a ton of times, and then I place it into my activity tracker.
And So you do also use an electronic note-taking system. You use Evernote to
Yes.
capture, because now if you're doing 100 books a year, you're capturing all the notes from those 100 books. And are you doing any sort of backlinking or linking to try to create that mental mind map, or is that just done in your own mind, not through the tools?
Uh, this is something that, sometimes people say a book is a great, if you've written a book, it becomes your best accountability partner, right? You teach what you most need to learn. I do tag within Evernote. So if I wanted to filter for all of my takeaways related to money, because I'm about to have a money or negotiation conversation, I could review them. In theory, I would be doing this far more frequently than I currently am. And I do use MindMeister, which is a mind mapping tool that Kevin Horsley introduced me to, and we kind of use together. I'd meet with him on a weekly basis, and I could do a better job at mind mapping more of my notes. I definitely. And in fact, I want to build a tool that sort of does this for you or with you in the future. So that's a future project.
Yeah, that's something that I'm exploring as well, because I'm in the same spot as you. If I've read 1,000 books, like this idea of, well, where is all that knowledge? Like in Tiago Forte has, building your second brain. And so I keep thinking it's the right thing to do. And it's not that easy when we're already doing as many things as we're doing. So like you, it's a project on the back burner that will happen. The
Yes.
question is just when. Maybe when I have one last full-time job. So I'm with you on that, Nick. Where I want to take it next, you talked a bit about accountability partners. You talked a bit about the time you spent with mentors. And we all hear, we see it on social media, Twitter, Instagram. You are who you surround yourself with. Generally, we talk about it being the 5 people you surround yourself with are going to determine who you become. You shed a little bit of a different light on it. You have this concept you call the 25%. And I found that a little bit more forgiving, if you will, or made a little more sense to bucket it the way you did. Can you take people through the 25% rule?
Absolutely. And I developed this out of necessity because when I first got into the world of personal development, there's a great metaphor that Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. says in his book, The Mastery of Self. He says, imagine you just woke up and you're at a party and you're totally sober, but everybody else around you is drunk. And they're just swinging from one end of the emotional spectrum to the other. And you're trying to conversate with these people, but nobody wants to talk to you because they're just caught up in all the drama and the gossip, and they're drinking and they're having fun, and you're sober. Like, that's how I felt when I first started reading these personal development books. It's like I wanted all of my friends and family to be as obsessed with this stuff as I was, but nobody would take to it. Nobody wanted to talk to me about it. At least most people didn't. And so I started to cut off a lot of relationships because I was reading that Jim Rohn quote, you are the average of the 5 people, and you should spend more time around mentors. And so I burned some bridges, kind of in an emotional way. I didn't do a great job at explaining myself, but I'm like, if you don't want to be entrepreneurial, if you don't want to improve yourself, if you just want to play video games and drink every night, like, I don't want to be around you anymore. I'm different, right? And that was driven from a place of ego. And I've come to realize now that I've consumed a lot more material and I've matured a little bit myself, dealt with the ego a little bit more, is that not everybody in your life is meant to serve as a personal development accountability partner. Like, some people are just friends, some people are just family members. Everybody has their faults. You can't, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? Bunch of metaphors. So I saw a video where Ty Lopez, internet marketer, love him or hate him, he has some good metaphors. I saw a video once where Ty Lopez originally, he had a rule of 33. So it kind of starts like this, the first 3 buckets. He says 33% of your time should be spent with mentors, people who have done what you want to do and have done it really well. And they've helped other people get there, right? That's the best definition of a mentor. And you can't always spend in-person time with these people. So you have to read their books and consume their courses and listen to them on podcasts and attend their events. That's how you can spend 33% of your time with mentors. Then he said 33% of your time should be spent with peers. These are people who are fighting the good fight, right? They're on the same playing field as you. They have similar goals. They're in a similar place. health, wealth, love, happiness. Like they're in a similar spot. And these are the people in your accountability groups. These are the people you work with, etc. Then he said 33% of your time should be spent with mentees, right? You should be giving back, refreshing the fundamentals, teaching what you learn. Teaching what you learn is one of the best forms of repetition because you're forced to reorganize the work and then teach it to other people. It's a way of ingraining it in your subconscious. And, a little bit of positive giving leads to a little bit of positive receiving, right? It's a reciprocal relationship. But I thought he was missing something. And this is why I've now developed the rule of 25% instead of 33. Time with yourself. That's the fourth bucket. That's the one that I think is super important that I think he missed in that speech that he gave one time in a miscellaneous thing. He probably made it up. And so time with yourself. That's time in meditation, mindfulness, reading, reflection, journaling, exercising, building goals, focusing on the future, saying affirmations, tons and tons of examples of how you can spend time with yourself. There's a funny Blaise Pascal quote that says something like, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly in a room alone for like 15 minutes or something. And it's like, I want to train that skill set. I want to love myself. When everything else is turned off and it's quiet and I'm alone, that's where I want to be the happiest. And I've been focusing on that for a long time now. And I can say that it does bring me a ton of joy. I meditate on a daily basis. I do all of the things that I just mentioned. And so that's the rule of 25%. Mentors, peers, mentees, and yourself.
Beautiful. I love it. You also talked earlier about the idea of when you were talking about beating that path and walking through the meadow, and what was grass becomes the default path. Part of what you were talking about there is this idea of compounding, which I think you and I are both really big fans of. I always say small, smart decisions plus time plus consistency equals exponential results. Some things that come into that. You've got compounding, you've got the 1% rule, the Matthew effect, which I loved learning about earlier this year and writing about in my newsletter. You've got this idea you talk about of flying out of control. So all things that tie to compounding and the powers of it. The challenge that I love to present and want to pick your brain about is we always focus on the positives of compounding because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do self-development. We're trying to create these habits that then compound to make us better people in a decade than we are today. But for the average listener, I would say compounding is likely working against them, right? It's that extra Twinkie a day. It's that, hey, I didn't take any steps today. I didn't read, or I watched 2 hours of television, in the compounding effect that has, which I think is the flying out of control example. So I just threw a lot out at you there that relates to compounding in any direction you want to take it, Nick. Wherever you want to go with that, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sure. Well, I'll give the flying out of control example. So imagine a plane is departing from Los Angeles and it's flying to New York City. So that's about 3,000 miles. But as the plane departs, somebody nudges the nose of the plane just 1%. Nobody notices. So the plane takes off, and let's say it's 1% to the south. So that 1% is compounding. And for a while, it's imperceptible. Nobody can tell. You can't even tell when you look at a graph of the difference. But as the plane continues, eventually, you realize that by the time it's supposed to be in New York City, it's about 150 miles south of New York City, somewhere in Delaware, using a US example. And you're totally right. That can happen for us or against us. That extra Twinkie every single day for a year, you don't really think about it, right? You don't really notice anything for a while, but you end up 15 pounds heavier as the result of that one Twinkie every single day for a year, 12 months from now. And so I do think a lot about that. In chapter 4 of my book, I talk about some of the downsides of the self-help industry. And I talk about momentum, how it can work for us or against us. And I think that sometimes people jump into the person. I've had hundreds of people reach out to me and say, hey, Nick, I just discovered your community. Where should I start? And I realized over time that if I made a book recommendation that was too advanced, it would compound that negative momentum, because that person walking in who's in a negative spiral, they're already feeling inadequate. They're already dealing with some like self-assurance issues. They already view the world through a negative lens. They're already in that victim mentality. And now they read a book about how somebody made $1 million in a day. That's not going to help them, right? It compounds the feeling of inferiority. So in order to reverse that momentum, you have to be really careful about beginning with the basics, books that aren't too aggressive, that don't highlight major success stories, that start small, smart steps like you highlighted in the right direction to begin to reverse that momentum. And the compound effect by Darren Hardy is a beautiful place to start, because it does gently talk about this subject, right? Small steps in the right direction repeated over a long period of time will lead to disproportionately positive results, like exponential progression, like you just highlighted. And so I have a lot of things to say about it. I think you just need to start small. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. An author I worked with recently, he said, no matter how many times you read Aesop's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, the tortoise always wins every single time.
Yeah.
And I love that example, because you don't need to make these big jumps. When people make big jumps, they fail. And if they're already in a negative spiral, they won't try again. And it stinks, because everybody has an opportunity to live an amazing life. It's just, you need to be reasonable. It needs to be an attainable. That's the A in SMART. It needs to be an attainable goal. And a 1% improvement every day, that's an attainable goal.
Absolutely. And let's flip it. You talked about some of those bad habits. How do we use your idea of restate, isolate, and eliminate to get rid of those bad habits?
Yeah, this stems from my time at an internship in college where I was running my own house painting business. And it was a sales objection framework, like to overcome objections, which was really interesting. And I never thought I would apply it to like removing bad habits, but restate, isolate, and handle. So let's say that you have the example that I give in the book was I used to eat Doritos, spicy nacho Doritos. I would eat a couple of bags a week. Now, I never had any like weight issues, but I knew they were unhealthy, and they always left me feeling bloated and kind of after eating an entire bag of spicy nacho Doritos. And so you have to start by restating the bad habit out loud. And it feels a little awkward, but we all have that moment where we become aware of the bad habit halfway through it, right? So I'm halfway through a bag of spicy nacho Doritos, and for a second, I'm aware of like, oh, I don't want to be doing this. You have to insert a little bit of control into that moment and restate it out loud. Like imagine you wake up in the morning and you want to get out of bed, right? You want to overcome that resistance, but you also want to push that snooze. So you have to restate that bad habit out loud in the middle of it. You have to say, I'm about to snooze the alarm, even though I want to get out of bed. Even though it's not going to make me feel better in 10 minutes, I'm about to do it. State it out loud to the universe. Or when your hand is in the bag of Doritos, like I'm eating Doritos, even though they're making me feel bloated. And I know that I'm going to come to regret this, but I'm going to continue eating them. Once you restate the habit, maybe even take a step away from the bag of Doritos or get out of bed and point at the alarm clock while you're doing it. And you really insert a little bit of control in that moment of awareness. That's where you have the opportunity to change things. So that's restating. Now, isolating. With the bag of Doritos, like, how do you remove the bad habit? How do you uninstall it? Well, it's being triggered by something. What is it being triggered by? Make a list of environmental factors that lead up to you automatically walking to the cabinet and grabbing the bag of Doritos. Is it the time of day? Is it the people that you're with? Is it your emotional state of hunger? What is it? And eliminate one of those environmental factors for a period of time and see if you still default to the action. Remove the trigger and see if you still end up repeating the behavior over and over again. And eventually you'll find one or two triggers that when eliminated, you don't end up defaulting to that activity anymore. So restate, isolate, and then handle. There are a few ways to handle it. I talk about one example in the book where you sort of multiply the effect of Doritos over a long period of time, and then you view that multiplied effect in the present moment. So I don't have the math in front of me, but let's say there are a bunch of calories, unnecessary, terrible calories in a bag of Doritos. And if you eat 2 or 3 bags a week, how many calories is that a week? Well, how many calories is that a year? How many calories is that over 5 years? And I remember in the math that I did in the book that when I looked at my Dorito eating habit over 5 years, it led to the equivalent of 178 pounds of fat. So every single time I looked at that bag of Doritos, I would think, wow, that's 178 pounds of fat over the next 5 years if I continue to eat these. And I started to run in the other direction, right? So
Ouch. Yeah,
restate the
yeah.
habit out loud when it happens to sort of insert more control in that slight moment of awareness to gain even more awareness. Separate yourself from it and restate it out loud like, this bag of Doritos makes me feel bloated. Isolate the behaviors that lead up to it. In my case, it was having them in the pantry and being hungry. So maybe eat a little bit of a bigger lunch so that you don't default to it. Stop buying them at the grocery store so that you don't need them anymore. Visualize it as 178 pounds of fat, and then it's handled. I'm not eating. I haven't had a spicy nacho Dorito in years, and I used to eat 100 bags of them a year.
I love it. So, Nick, I'm going to fire some rapid fire questions at you. What is one book that you've read that's had a massive change on your life?
One book that I've read that's had a massive change on my life that I haven't mentioned yet is Vagabonding by Rolf Potts. It's a book on the long-term art of world travel. And after reading that book, I've spent time in 25 different countries, sometimes for up to 3 months at a time. And I love international travel. So if you're somebody who thinks, oh, only rich people can do that, I can't do that, read Vagabonding by Rolf Potts.
Beautiful. What are you currently reading right now? I know sometimes you have multiple books on the go.
I do. I have quite a few books on the go. Tuesdays with Mori. Have you read that book?
Not yet. No.
So it's the story of a student going back to revisit an old professor in his dying days and documenting the experience and some of his greatest life lessons as he passes away. And again, it's on this subject of mortality and living life in the present moment. And I'm really loving it.
Oh, it's beautiful. What is one thing that you've bought in the last 12 months under $1,000 that Nick has thought to himself, damn, I wish I'd bought this sooner?
That's a great Tim Ferriss style question. I like that. I just got this Echo Go water hydrogenator that I've really been loving. And I don't have it on my desk right now. It's downstairs. But the idea is that if you add extra unbound hydrogen molecules to your drinking water, that you can actually absorb the supplement, like the nutrients and minerals from the supplements that you're taking and the food that you're eating a lot more efficiently. So you actually get more from the food and supplements that you're consuming. And so I've been feeling like $1,000,000 for a few years now, but definitely after buying that water bottle. And I think it's priced at $250.
Oh, I've got to research this. And then because the show's about growth, what's one mindset shift, habit change, or behavior change you have implemented that's had an oversized impact on your life?
I have so many of them. I think going from victim to hero, I mean, that's the first one that comes to mind. In Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, he talks about shifting from I can't afford this to how can I afford this, to a place of curiosity, right? A victim says, I can't afford this. A hero says, how can I afford this? I'll figure it out. I'm capable. I believe in myself. I have confidence, self-assurance. And so I apply that to every area of my life. There's no problem that I meet or obstacle that I face where I get overwhelmed anymore. I just go to a place of curiosity. Like somebody else has figured this out and they've probably written a book about it. So let me do the work. Let me figure it out too.
I love it. And we went pretty far. We went pretty deep and wide in the book. Is there anything that we missed that you want to make sure that you get across to the audience today?
You did a great job researching the book and asking great questions, Clint. I'll just, to kind of wrap things up, say that I do believe there is a book to solve every single problem that we're facing. And over 100 billion people have lived before us. Like we think we're pretty unique. The problems we're facing are pretty unique, but the fact is they're not. Human beings have been facing very similar problems for thousands of years. And a small percentage of people have figured it out, right? They've then condensed decades of their lived experience and greatest life lessons into days. And they've written about it. And these books are available for $20. We can read and implement them in a few hours of our time. And most of us choose not to. like we started the conversation with. You're a fan of Stoicism as well. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, almost 2,000 years ago, was writing about struggling to get out of bed. We all struggle to get out of bed, but how do you overcome resistance? People like Marcus figured it out, and we can read their greatest life lessons that took them decades to figure out, and we can jump the line. We can condense time. We can figure it out ourselves. We can overcome problems. I heard Jordan Peterson say once that if you are dealing with an issue on a daily basis over the next 30 years, so 365 times 30, you'll deal with that problem almost 11,000 times. But you don't have to. You can solve it. And life doesn't have to be so hard. You can enjoy the passage of time. And I think these books are a great way to do that. So that's my final message.
I love it. Beautiful way to end it. And where can people find you?
If anybody wants a custom book recommendation from me, I love playing book matchmaker. You can direct message me at BookThinkers on Instagram. That's our largest and most vibrant community. And I answer every message. Sometimes it takes me a couple of days or a week to get to you. But tell me a problem you're facing or a skill that you want to develop, and I'll provide a custom book recommendation to you. And of course, there are links in our bio there to check out everything that we do as an agency. Some other reader resources, a link to my book, Rise of the Reader, which you've gotten a preview of today. I hope you buy a copy, and that's where you can go.
Beautiful. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.